Well, here's one of the oddest problems I've ever encountered. This is a 2016 Kia Forte. It's got the 1.8 in it. The original engine locked up. I put a used engine in it, 77,000 mile good engine. I test drove it about 10 miles, completed all the monitors with no pending codes, no codes of any kind. Gave it back to her. She drove about 120 miles. And 2 days later, she contacted me saying the check engine light was on, traction control light was on, and it was running rough. So I got it back. It had a code. The only code in the engine control module was a P0335 crankshaft position sensor circuit code. And there was a code in the ESP stability control module for I think lost communication. No, well, check ECM bad information. Something like I don't remember the exact code. But anyway, so the issue is the problem only happens when the engine's been running about approximately 20 minutes, and it has to get real hot. Apparently closing the hood and that helps build the heat. It only happens when it gets really hot. When the engine gets really hot, the cooling fan is cycled on and off at least twice. And once it runs fine up until then, and then when that happens, then when you start to rev it up, when it hits about 1500, it'll start to stumble, and the tach will go down to zero, and it'll start running rough, and it won't rev past 3000, and it will just every time you hit 1500, it'll stumble, and the RPM tach will drop down to zero, and it idles rough like it's missing. But all the data doesn't show any evidence of a miss. I can look at the injector pulse width data in the scan tool. That doesn't show anything. Each individual cylinder's ignition timing, that doesn't show anything. The fuel pump's on, but it's whatever the case may be. So I scoped the crank sensor signal, and it looks perfect up until the failure happens, except the voltage is kind of low because according to the surface information, they show a waveform of a good crank sensor. It's showing around 9 volts at idle, and the peaks, and this one is showing around 6.5. But nevertheless, I mean there's no irregularity in the pattern, and it syncs with the cam sensor signals perfectly. But when the failure starts to happen, all of a sudden the crank sensor voltage drops down to 500 millivolts, less than a volt. But the pattern is still the same, but just the amplitude drops. And I couldn't initially, because this is a very reluctant sensor, which is essentially generates its own power. I assumed that this is a bad crank sensor, so I put a new Kia crank sensor in it. Same problem. But one thing I did notice that was odd, even before I placed the crank sensor, I noticed that once this failure happened, if you turn the key off and then you turn the key back on again without starting the engine, the fuel pump would just constantly cycle on and off every few seconds. It's crazy. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. I checked all the powers and grounds going to the module, see if anything is intermittent. I checked is it getting some kind of, odd, intermittent signal on the crank or cam sensor signal wires at the ECM. Nope, nothing unusual there. And I even unplugged all the cam and crank sensors and turned the key on, and that problem still happens. The fuel pump cycles on and off. And so I looked at the service data, looked at all the possible inputs that could cause this, and I also discovered that this ECM connector here, if I disconnect this and then turn the key on, that the fuel pump cycling stops. If I plug it back in, it starts again. So then I went to look and see, what all circuits, go to that connector. And it's mostly, sensors and actuators on the engine. And so I one by one disconnected every sensor and actuator that goes to that connector. Didn't make any difference. Then I figured out that there was also pretty much most of the transmission sensors, solenoids, and such also go to this connector. So I thought, that's interesting. So I figured, well, let me disconnect the main connector of the transmission and see what happens. And I disconnected that, and what do you know? That's where the issue is. So exactly what is going on, I have yet to determine. I need to do some further testing, but this is very odd. Let me just show you. Okay, key on. I don't know if you can hear that. Let me go up front to where the relay is, and you can hear the relay clicking. Okay, now let me turn the key off and unplug it. Unplug the transmission connector, and you can see that it stops. Come on. Okay. There we go. It's unplugged. Key on. Stops. Very, very weird. I have no idea what is going on here, but it only happens when it gets, like I said, very hot. And after I placed the crank sensor that didn't fix it, I was suspecting bad ECM, but this kind of makes me second guess it. So I need to do some testing to see what in the transmission can possibly cause this weird issue, and whether or not the something in the transmission is causing a abnormality in the crank sensor signal. Anyway, I guess there'll probably be a part 2 to this, and when I find out what's going on, I'll make another video.